At 2 p.m. hours on October 26, 1944, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in a muddy foxhole in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, watching the tree line disappear into a wall of gray fog. The temperature was dropping fast. The rain had turned the floor of the forest into a thick, sucking clay that pulled boots off of feet and jammed the actions of rifles. This was not the France the newsreels showed back home. There were no cheering crowds, no wine, and no sunny fields of wheat. This was a dark, ancient forest that felt like it wanted to kill them just as much as the Germans did. The trees were so thick they blocked out the sky, and the undergrowth was a tangled mess of briars and wet leaves that grabbed at uniforms and equipment. It was a place where a man could die 10 feet away from his best friend, and his friend would never even hear the body hit the ground. Murphy wiped the rain from his eyes and checked his weapon. It sat across his knees, small and light and made of polished wood. It looked like a toy. It looked like something a father would give his 12-year-old son to learn how to shoot tin cans off a fence post. It was the US 30 cal M1. It weighed 5.5 pounds. It fired a round that looked more like a pistol bullet than a rifle cartridge. To the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, it was a joke. They called it the Squirrel Gun. They called it the pop gun. They said it was a weapon for cooks, truck drivers, and clerks who would never see the front line. Real infantrymen carried the M-1 Garand. The Garand was a 9-pound sledgehammer of a rifle that fired the full-power 30-06 cartridge. The Garand could punch through a brick wall or a tree trunk and still kill the man hiding behind it. The carbine could barely punch through a helmet at 200 yards. And just like his rifle, Murphy was the subject of endless jokes. He was 19 years old, but he looked 14. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds soaking wet. His uniform did not fit. The sleeves were too long, the helmet wobbled on his head, and his pack looked like it was going to crush his spine. When he had tried to enlist in the Marines, they laughed him out of the recruiting office. When he tried the paratroopers, they told him he was too small. Even the Army had tried to make him a cook because they did not think he could handle the physical stress of combat. The men in his platoon called him Babyface. They placed bets on how long he would last. They looked at the little kid with the little gun and shook their heads. They knew what was waiting for them in these mountains, and they did not think a boy with a squirrel gun was going to make a difference. The mockery had started back in training, and it had followed him all the way to France. The old salts, the sergeants who had fought in North Africa and Sicily, told him to get rid of the carbine. They told him stories about the weapon's failures. They said the round was so weak that if you shot a German in the winter, the bullet would bounce off his heavy wool coat. They said it lacked the stopping power to put a man down when he was charging at you with a bayonet. They said the sights were garbage and the effective range was laughable. Carrying a carbine in an infantry platoon was seen as a sign of weakness. It meant you couldn't handle the weight of a real man's rifle. It meant you were looking for the easy way out. Every time Murphy cleaned the weapon, he could feel the eyes of the other men on him. He could hear their whispers. They wanted to know why the lieutenant was carrying a toy into the meat grinder. But Murphy ignored them. He had grown up hunting rabbits and squirrels in Texas to feed his family. He knew something the experts did not. He knew that in the dense brush of the woods, a 9-pound rifle was a liability. The Garand was 43 inches long. In the tangled vines and low branches of the Vosges, swinging a Garand was like trying to swing a baseball bat in a phone booth. It snagged on everything. It was slow to bring to the shoulder. And the recoil was heavy. If you missed your first shot with a Garand, the muzzle climbed high, and it took precious seconds to bring the sights back down on the target. The carbine was different. It was 35 inches long. It was short, handy, and balanced perfectly in the hands. You could carry it all day without your arms turning to jelly. You could point it like a finger. Murphy understood the trade-off. He knew he was giving up range and power. He knew he couldn't get into a sniper duel at 500 yards. But in this forest, nobody could see 500 yards. The war here was fought at 50 yards, sometimes 20, sometimes 5. At that distance, you didn't need a bullet that could travel 3 miles. You needed a bullet that could get out of the barrel fast. You needed a gun that became a part of your body. The carbine had a 15-round detachable magazine. The Garand held 8 rounds in an internal clip. That meant Murphy had almost double the firepower before he had to reload, and when he fired, the carbine barely kicked. He could put 3 rounds into a target in the time it took a Garand shooter to fire once. The experts saw a weak bullet. Murphy saw a force multiplier. He saw a tool that allowed a 100-pound man to move faster and shoot straighter than a 200-pound German. The criticism from his platoon wasn't just friendly ribbing. It was genuine concern. They were heading into the Clerks Quarry, a rocky, jagged scar in the earth that the Germans had turned into a fortress. Intelligence said the woods around the quarry were crawling with enemy snipers and machine gun teams. These weren't the second-rate troops the Allies had steamrolled in the summer. These were hardened veterans. They knew the terrain. They had had weeks to dig in, to sight their mortars, to camouflage their positions. They were waiting for the Americans to stumble into the trap. The men of the platoon checked their grenades. They checked their ammunition belts. They looked at their heavy Garands and felt reassured by the weight of the steel and wood. They looked at Murphy and his little carbine and felt a knot of anxiety in their stomachs. If things went bad, if the Germans came at them in a human wave, that little gun was going to run dry or jam or fail to stop the enemy. And then the lieutenant would be dead, and the platoon would be leaderless. The sun began to set, but it didn't really get dark. It just got grayer. The fog thickened until it was like breathing soup. The temperature dropped near freezing, but they couldn't light fires. A fire would be a beacon for every German mortar crew in the valley, so they sat in their wet holes and shivered. They ate cold rations out of tin cans with dirty fingers. They listened to the sounds of the forest, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a dead leaf, the wind moaning through the pine needles. Every sound could be nothing, or it could be a German patrol creeping forward to slit their throats. Murphy sat on the edge of his foxhole, his eyes scanning the gloom. He didn't just look, he dissected the darkness. He watched for the shapes that didn't belong, the straight lines of a rifle barrel or the curve of a helmet. He ran his thumb over the operating slide of the carbine. The metal was cold and slick with oil. He checked the magazine again. 15 rounds of 110-grain full metal jacket. He had 4 more magazines in a pouch on his belt and 2 more in his pockets. 105 rounds total. It didn't seem like enough, not for what was coming. The silence in the forest was heavy, unnatural. The birds had stopped singing hours ago. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a dam breaks. Murphy shifted his weight. His boots were filled with icy water. His uniform was soaked through to the skin. But his hands were warm and dry, tucked into his jacket, keeping his trigger finger ready. At 4 p.m., a runner came up the line. The order was to hold position. Do not advance. Do not retreat. Dig in and wait for morning. The command believed the Germans were regrouping for a major push. They wanted to break the American line and drive them back out of the mountains. Murphy's platoon was the tip of the spear. They were the furthest unit forward, exposed on 3 sides. If the attack came, it would hit them first. The men grumbled as they dug their holes deeper. They cursed the mud. They cursed the officers in the rear who were sleeping in warm tents. And they cursed the little lieutenant with the toy gun who had led them into this hole. Murphy didn't say a word. He just watched the trees. He knew the attack was coming. He could feel it. The experts said the carbine was useless. The experts said he was too small for war. Tonight, in the black heart of the Vosges Mountains, the experts were going to be proven wrong, or Murphy was going to die trying. He pulled the bolt back slightly, checking the chamber one last time. The brass casing glinted in the fading light. He let the bolt slide forward with a quiet metallic click. The weapon was ready. The boy was ready. The forest began to dissolve into total blackness, and the waiting game ended. The attack did not start with a shout or a bugle call. It started with a sound that every infantryman knew in his bones, a sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up straight. It was the metallic clack-clack of a German MG-42 machine gun bolt slamming forward, and then the forest exploded. At 4 a.m., the darkness was ripped apart by streaks of green tracer fire. The German machine guns were set up in a crossfire, and they were chopping through the undergrowth like invisible chainsaws. Branches, leaves, and dirt flew into the air as the bullets walked back and forth across the American line. The noise was deafening. It wasn't the pop-pop-pop of movies. It was a continuous tearing sound, like a massive piece of canvas being ripped in half right next to your ear. The men of the platoon pressed themselves into the mud at the bottom of their holes. To lift a head meant losing it. This was the moment the experts had warned about. This was the moment where you needed a battle rifle, a weapon that could reach out and smash the enemy. But in the pitch-black chaos of the Vosges forest, the heavy Garands were struggling. The men tried to swing their rifles toward the muzzle flashes, but the 43-inch barrels snagged on the thick vines and low-hanging branches. The forest was too tight. It was like trying to swing a boat oar inside a closet. The weight of the weapon, which felt so reassuring on the parade ground, was now a curse. 9.5 pounds of steel, and wood felt like 50 pounds when you were trying to snap aim at a shadow moving 5 yards away. Men were cursing, fumbling with the 8-round clips, trying to jam them into the actions of their rifles with cold, muddy fingers. If they missed the rhythm, the bolt would slam shut on their thumbs, smashing the bone. But Lieutenant Murphy was not fumbling. While the rest of the line was pinned down by the sheer weight of the German fire, Murphy was moving. This was where the toy gun stopped being a joke and started being a lifeline. The M-1 Carbine was so short it didn't catch on the brush. Murphy rolled out of his foxhole and into the darkness. He held the weapon with one hand, using his other hand to pull himself through the mud. He moved like a lizard, belly flat against the wet leaves. He wasn't staying in a static position to die. He was hunting. He crawled 10 yards to the right, finding an angle on the nearest German machine gun team. The gunners were focused on the main line of foxholes, their attention locked on the muzzle flashes of the American Garands. They didn't see the small shadow flanking them. They didn't hear the small man with the small gun. Murphy rose to a crouch behind a moss-covered oak tree. He saw the silhouette of the German gunner, lit up by the strobe light flashing of his own weapon. A Garand shooter would have to brace his feet, shoulder the heavy stock, and line up the sights carefully to manage the recoil. Murphy just brought the little carbine up. It pointed as naturally as his index finger. He didn't fire one shot. He squeezed the trigger 3 times in less than a second. Pop, pop, pop. The carbine barely moved in his hands. There was no heavy kick, no muzzle rise that blinded him. The 3 bullets hit the gunner before the man even knew he was flanked. The MG-42 fell silent. The gunner collapsed over the barrel and the ammunition belt twisted in the mud. Murphy didn't celebrate. He didn't pause. He knew the rule of the carbine: shoot and move. The distinct crack of his weapon had given away his position. He dropped back into the mud and scrambled to a new spot, moving another 15 yards to the left. A second German soldier, an assistant gunner, had pulled a pistol and was searching for the shooter. Murphy saw him first. This was the advantage of the light weight. Murphy could swing the carbine 180 degrees in the blink of an eye. He put 2 rounds into the second German's chest. The man folded up and hit the ground. The experts said the .30 caliber round wouldn't stop a man. They said it was underpowered. But at 20 yards, a bullet traveling at almost 2,000 feet per second did not need to be a cannonball. It just needed to hit the right spot. And because the gun was so controllable, Murphy could hit that spot over and over again. Back in the main line, the platoon was starting to realize something was happening. The withering fire from the German right flank had stopped. They heard the rapid-fire bark of the lieutenant's carbine. It sounded different than the heavy boom of the Garands and the sharp crack of the German Mausers. It sounded like a frantic tapping, fast and angry. They saw muzzle flashes popping up from places where no American soldier was supposed to be. Murphy was conducting a one-man war of harassment. He was popping up, firing a burst, and disappearing before the Germans could return fire. He was using the terrain and the weapon exactly as they were designed. He wasn't trying to match the Germans power for power. He was outpacing them. He was faster than their decision-making loop. The Germans were confused. They had expected a static line of terrified Americans huddled in holes. Instead, they were taking fire from their flanks, from behind trees, from angles that made no sense. They started to shout orders to each other in the dark. Americans on the right. Americans in the trees. They thought they were being counterattacked by a squad of submachine gunners. They didn't realize it was one kid with a Squirrel Gun and pockets full of 15-round magazines. Murphy reloaded on the move. He hit the magazine release, let the empty box fall into the mud, and slapped a fresh one in. It took 2 seconds. A Garand shooter would still be fumbling for a clip on his belt. Murphy had 30 more rounds ready to go before the average rifleman could fire 8. But the Germans were professionals. They realized their initial assault had stalled, so they changed tactics. They stopped trying to overwhelm the line with machine guns and started using grenades. The stick grenades, nicknamed potato mashers, came flying through the trees. They tumbled through the air with a hollow whoosh sound, exploding with sharp cracks that sent shrapnel slicing through the bark of the pines. One grenade landed on the lip of a foxhole near Murphy's position. The explosion threw dirt and rocks into the air, wounding 2 men. The screams of the wounded cut through the noise of the battle. "Medic, I'm hit." "Medic," the panic began to rise again. The platoon was dangerously close to breaking. If the Germans realized the Americans were hurt, they would charge with bayonets. And in a hand-to-hand fight, the sheer numbers of the enemy would wipe the platoon out. Murphy saw the shift. He saw a group of 5 German infantrymen gathering near a fallen log, fixing bayonets for a charge. They were 50 yards away, barely visible through the fog. A Garand shooter might have picked off 1, maybe 2, before the recoil threw his aim off or the clip ran dry. Murphy took a deep breath. He braced the carbine against the side of a tree. He didn't panic. He treated it like shooting jackrabbits back in Texas. He started on the left and worked his way right. He fired as fast as he could pull the trigger, but he aimed every shot. The carbine jumped in his hands, but it settled back instantly. Empty casings spun out of the ejection port in a golden arc. 1 German fell, then the second. The 3rd man hesitated, looking around to see where the fire was coming from. Murphy put a round in his shoulder and another in his leg. The 4th and 5th men dropped to the ground, abandoning the charge, crawling backward into the safety of the dark. Murphy had broken the assault wave single-handedly. He had put 10 rounds downrange in 4 seconds. The barrel of his carbine was smoking, the wood of the handguard warm against his palm. He ejected the partially spent magazine and loaded a fresh one. He didn't wait to count the bodies. He knew there were more. The immediate threat of the bayonet charge was gone, but the battle was far from over. The German commander realized that small arms fire wasn't enough to dig these Americans out. The wood suddenly grew brighter, lit by a terrifying, flickering orange glow. A flare popped overhead, drifting down on a small parachute, casting long, dancing shadows that made the trees look like skeletons. And then came the sound that every soldier feared more than machine guns. It was the thump-thump-thump of mortars leaving their tubes. The Germans were bringing up the heavy artillery. They were going to pulverize the coordinate. Murphy looked back at his platoon. They were battered, bleeding, and low on ammunition. The Garand shooters were frantic, asking each other for clips. The extra weight of the .30-06 ammo meant they carried less of it. Murphy checked his pockets. He still had 60 rounds left. He was the only thing standing between his men and a massacre. The mortar rounds started to land, shaking the ground like a giant hammering on the earth. The explosions walked closer and closer to their position. The toy gun had saved them from the first wave, but now the war had escalated to a level where a 5-pound rifle seemed insignificant. The experts would have said it was time to retreat. The experts would have said the position was untenable, but Murphy wasn't listening to experts. He was looking at the map in his head. He knew that the mortars were firing from a ridge about 200 yards up the slope. It was a suicide mission to go up there. It meant leaving the cover of the foxholes and advancing directly into the teeth of the enemy main force. It meant crawling through a minefield of exploding shells and machine gun fire. Murphy looked at his carbine. He looked at the terrified faces of his men. He tightened the strap of his helmet. He wasn't going to wait for the mortars to kill them one by one. He was going to take his Squirrel Gun and go hunting for the mortar crew. He tapped the shoulder of the man nearest to him. "Cover me," he whispered. And then the little lieutenant disappeared into the orange-lit fog, heading straight toward the enemy line. The climb up the ridge was a nightmare of noise and mud. The mortar shells were landing behind Murphy now, chewing up the ground where his platoon was dug in. The shockwaves slapped against his back, pushing him forward, vibrating through his ribcage. Every explosion was a reminder of the clock ticking down. If he didn't silence those tubes, there wouldn't be a platoon left to go back to. He moved uphill, grabbing onto exposed roots and wet rocks to pull himself up the slick clay. The M-1 Carbine was slung across his chest. A Garand would have been dragging in the mud, banging against his knees, getting tangled in the undergrowth. But the little carbine stayed tight to his body, out of the way, ready. He was moving into the heart of the German position, a lone ant crawling into a nest of angry hornets. Visibility was less than 20 yards. The fog was mixing with the cordite smoke from the explosions to create a thick, stinging haze that burned the eyes and throat. Murphy stopped behind a large boulder to catch his breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked his equipment. 3 full magazines left in his pockets, 1 in the gun, 60 rounds. Doctrine said 60 rounds of carbine ammo would just make a German angry. It said you needed a heavy machine gun to take this hill. Murphy didn't have a heavy machine gun. He had 5 pounds of wood and steel and a desperate need to stop the killing. He crested the ridge and saw them. The mortar pit was a shallow depression scooped out of the earth, reinforced with logs. There were 3 men manning the tube. One was dropping shells down the spout. One was adjusting the elevation wheel. The third was watching the impact area through binoculars, shouting corrections. 2 more infantrymen were standing guard with Mauser rifles, scanning the tree line below, looking for the American counterattack. They were looking down the hill. They weren't looking at the small bush 30 yards to their flank. Murphy raised the carbine. He didn't rush. He settled his elbows into the mud to create a stable firing platform. He peered through the peep sight, lining up the front post on the man with the binoculars. The distance was 35 yards. At this range, the weak carbine bullet would hit with more than 600 foot-pounds of energy. It was plenty. Murphy squeezed the trigger. The little rifle barked. The German officer with the binoculars jerked violently and collapsed. Before the other men could even process that their commander was dead, Murphy shifted his aim. He didn't have to fight the recoil. The carbine stayed flat. He put the crosshairs on the loader and fired twice. Pop, pop. The loader fell across the mortar tube, knocking it out of alignment. The rhythm of the German bombardment was broken instantly. The remaining 3 Germans panicked. They spun around, trying to locate the source of the fire. But the flash from Murphy's barrel was hidden by the brush, and the sound of the carbine was lost in the echoes of the battle. The 2 riflemen with the Mausers racked the bolts of their weapons. Clack, clack. They fired blindly into the darkness, the heavy muzzle blasts lighting up the trees. but a bolt-action rifle is slow. To fire, you have to lift the bolt handle, pull it back, push it forward, and lock it down. It takes time, it takes movement. Murphy didn't have to do any of that. He just kept pulling the trigger. He treated the trigger like he was tapping a telegraph key. He put a wall of lead in the air. He fired at the muzzle flashes of the Mausers. He fired at the movement in the mortar pit. He emptied the 15-round magazine in 5 seconds. To the Germans, it must have sounded like they had stumbled into a machine gun nest. The volume of fire was overwhelming. They dove for cover, pressing their faces into the dirt, terrified to move. Murphy dropped the empty magazine. It hit a rock with a metallic ting. He grabbed a fresh one from his pocket and slammed it home. He pulled the charging handle back and let it fly. He was reloaded and ready to fire again in less than 3 seconds. In a close-range brawl, firepower wasn't about the size of the bullet. It was about how many bullets you could put in the air. The carbine was a force multiplier. It allowed one man to create the suppression of 5. Murphy waited. He saw a helmet rise up from the mortar pit. The German was trying to spot him. Murphy put a round through the helmet. The head dropped back down. Silence fell over the ridge. The mortar was silent. The Mausers were silent. Murphy lay still, listening. He could hear the ragged breathing of the survivors. He could hear the click of a grenade pin being pulled. He knew what was coming. They couldn't see him, so they were going to frag the area. Murphy rolled to his left, scrambling on his hands and knees, moving 10 yards away from his firing position. He stopped behind the trunk of a fallen pine tree. A second later, 2 stick grenades exploded right where he had been lying. The blast threw mud and wood chips over his uniform, but he was untouched. He had used the carbine's mobility to shoot, move, and survive. He popped up from his new position. The Germans thought they had killed him. They were rising from their cover, weapons ready, moving to check the body. They were exposed. Murphy rested the carbine on the pine log and opened fire again. The surprise was total. The lead German took a round in the chest and spun around. The second man tried to run, but Murphy tracked him, firing as he swung the gun. The third man threw his hands up, shouting something in German, surrendering to the darkness. Murphy didn't shoot. He kept his weapon trained on the survivor, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger, ready to fire if the man made a wrong move. The fight on the ridge was over in less than 2 minutes. 5 Germans down, 1 captured. The mortar tube neutralized, and the toy gun was still humming, ready for more. Murphy stood up, his legs shaking from the adrenaline dump. He walked over to the mortar pit. The scene was gruesome, a testament to the effectiveness of the weapon everyone had laughed at. The rounds hadn't bounced off coats. They hadn't failed to penetrate. At combat distance, the carbine had done its job with brutal efficiency. Murphy looked at the Mauser rifles lying in the mud. They were beautiful machines, finely machined, powerful, but they were heavy. They were slow. In the thick woods of the Vosges, they were relics. The future of war was in his hands. Light, fast, and high capacity, but the night wasn't finished with him yet. As Murphy began to disable the mortar tube, smashing the sights with a rock, he heard a new sound. It was the roar of an engine, heavy tracks crushing branches. A German armored half-track was pushing up the trail to reinforce the ridge. It was mounting a 20mm cannon. A carbine could kill men, but it couldn't kill a tank. The experts would have said this was the end. You don't fight armor with a pistol cartridge. Murphy looked at his prisoner. He motioned with the barrel of the gun for the man to run. The Germans scrambled down the hill into the dark. Murphy was alone again. He could see the headlights of the half-track cutting through the fog. It was scanning the woods, the cannon sweeping back and forth. Murphy knew he couldn't penetrate the armor, but he also knew that half-tracks had open tops. The crew was exposed. He checked his ammunition. 1 full magazine left, 15 rounds. He moved toward the trail, staying in the shadows of the large oaks. He let the vehicle get close. He could smell the diesel exhaust. He could hear the gears grinding. At 20 yards, he stepped out from behind a tree. The gunner on the half-track saw him. He started to swing the massive cannon around. It was a race between a 20mm autocannon and a 5-pound carbine. The cannon was heavy, geared, slow to traverse. The carbine was essentially an extension of Murphy's arms. Murphy didn't aim for the vehicle. He aimed for the crew. He fired a rapid burst at the driver's vision slit. A lucky round found the gap. The half-track swerved violently, crashing into a tree. The gunner was thrown off balance. Murphy shifted fire to the open turret. He emptied the rest of the magazine into the crew compartment. He wasn't trying to snipe. He was trying to fill the space with lead. The half-track stalled. The engine sputtered and died. There was no movement from inside. Murphy stood there, the slide of his carbine locked back on an empty chamber. Click, he was dry. He had taken on a mortar team, an infantry squad, and an armored vehicle with a weapon that was supposed to be suitable only for clerks. And he had won. The woods were quiet again. The only sound was the hissing of the half-track's radiator. Murphy dropped the empty magazine and patted his pockets. Empty. He had fired every round he brought with him. He turned and began the walk back down the hill. He was exhausted. His uniform was torn, covered in mud and blood that wasn't his. He was shivering from the cold and the shock, but he was alive. As he descended back toward the American line, the fog began to lift slightly. The gray light of dawn was starting to bleed through the trees. He could see the foxholes of his platoon. They were still there. They were alive because the mortars had stopped. They were alive because the boy had gone up the hill and done the work of 10 men. As he approached the perimeter, a sentry challenged him. "Halt, password." Murphy was too tired to remember the password. "It's Murphy," he croaked. "Don't shoot." The sentry lowered his rifle. He stared at the lieutenant. He stared at the smoking, mud-caked carbine hanging from Murphy's shoulder. He looked up the hill where the smoke was still rising from the German position. He didn't say a word. He just stepped aside and let him pass. Murphy slid back into his foxhole. The other men looked at him with wide eyes. They saw the empty ammunition pouches. They saw the way his hands shook as he tried to open his canteen. Nobody made a joke. Nobody asked if he had gone rabbit hunting. The sergeant, a man who had told Murphy to throw the carbine away a week ago, crawled over. He looked at the lieutenant, then he looked at the little rifle. He reached into his own webbing and pulled out 2 fresh 15-round magazines of .30 caliber ammunition. He handed them to Murphy without a word. It was an offering. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement that the hierarchy had changed. The toy was a weapon. The child was a killer, and the experts didn't know a damn thing. The sun finally broke through the fog around noon the next day. The light revealed the aftermath of the night's work. Up on the ridge, American patrols found the wreckage of the German position. They found the mortar tube, its sights smashed. They found the half-track, its windshield shattered and its crew dead inside. And they found the spent brass. Hundreds of small, pistol-sized casings littered the ground around the oak trees and the fallen logs. It looked like someone had emptied a bucket of brass into the mud. The men picked up the casings and turned them over in their fingers. They were marked .30 carbine. They weren't the big, heavy brass of the Garands. They were the leftovers of the Squirrel Gun. The story of the ridge spread through the 3rd Infantry Division like wildfire. Soldiers love a rumor, but they love a hero even more. The story grew with every telling. By the time it reached the rear echelon, Murphy hadn't just killed 5 Germans, he had killed 50. He hadn't just stopped a half-track, he had wrestled a Tiger tank, but the core truth remained. The smallest man in the company, armed with the smallest gun, had done the biggest job. The mocking stopped. Nobody called it a toy anymore. When Murphy walked through the chow line, men stepped aside. They looked at the battered wooden stock of his carbine with new respect. They realized that the weapon wasn't the point. The man behind the weapon was the point. The carbine was just the tool that let Audie Murphy be Audie Murphy. The battle at the Clerks Quarry was just the beginning. For the next 3 months, Murphy and his carbine cut a path through France and into Germany. He used it in the Kalmar pocket, where he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and held off an entire company of German infantry. He used it in the woods of Holzwihr. He used it until the finish on the stock was worn down to bare wood and the barrel was practically shot out. He never switched to the Garand. He never asked for a Thompson submachine gun. He stuck with the light, handy rifle that allowed him to move faster than the enemy. Back in Washington, the Ordnance Department still wrote reports calling the carbine a failure. They argued over ballistics charts and stopping power. But out in the mud of Europe, the debate was over. The men on the line knew that in a chaotic, close-quarters fight, the toy was a lifesaver. Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971. He was 45 years old. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, just across the river from the Pentagon. His grave is one of the most visited sites in the cemetery. People leave flowers, flags, and sometimes small brass casings. They leave them to honor the man who proved that size doesn't measure courage. They leave them to honor the child soldier who stood his ground when the world was burning. But there is a deeper lesson in Murphy's story, one that goes beyond just a man and a gun. It's a lesson about the arrogance of expertise. The generals and the designers thought they knew what war looked like. They thought it was about big numbers and heavy metal. They looked at the carbine and saw a toy because it didn't fit their model of power. They looked at Murphy and saw a weakling because he didn't look like a recruiting poster. They were blinded by their own assumptions. They forgot that war is a human endeavor. It is decided by spirit, by reflex, by the will to survive. A 9-pound rifle is useless if the soldier is too exhausted to lift it. A powerful bullet is useless if you can't hit the target. Murphy showed that the best equipment is the equipment that works for you. He took a tool that was mocked and turned it into an instrument of victory. He proved that the underdog, armed with the right mindset and the right tool, can change the course of history. Today, the M-1 Carbine sits in museums behind glass. Most people walk past it without a second glance. It looks unassuming. It doesn't have the menacing profile of an MG42 or the classic lines of a Garand. It looks like a simple sporting rifle. But if you look closely at the ones that served in the Vosges, the ones with the scars in the wood and the finish worn off the metal, you are looking at a piece of history that defied the odds. You are looking at the rifle that saved a platoon on a dark night in France. You are looking at the rifle that made Audie Murphy a legend. If this story moved you, if you believe that heroes come in all sizes, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube that these stories matter. It helps us find more forgotten chapters of history and bring them into the light. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We are digging through the archives every day, looking for the men and women who stood up when it counted. We want to make sure their names are never forgotten. Drop a comment below. Tell us if you've ever fired an M-1 Carbine. Tell us what you think about the debate between heavy caliber and lightweight, or just tell us you're here to pay your respects to Audie Murphy. We read every comment. You are the reason we do this. You are the guardians of this history. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And as always, keep your powder dry.